Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
If we could give today a theme, I think it would be appropriate to say the theme for today has been just as a song we have sung. Where He leads, I'll follow. We began in our Bible class hour this morning talking about the different areas in which Jesus' ministry of 3.5 years existed. And we talked about Galilee and Judea and Perea and all of those cities. And we noticed something that was specific in them. He worked. When we made it into our sermon hour, we talked about heaven. And we all can conclude that the life of Jesus points to one crucial event, the day in which the judgment of mankind exists, and heaven's doors are open for those that are faithful. And tonight will become no different. And we could give it the same theme, where He leads, I will follow. With, of course, October being Missions Month, and we've talked about that quite a bit, we're going to spend some time in more of a mission-minded sermon tonight. But I want to do so with a word in which we know and usually understand. But it has a lot to do with our community. It has a lot to do with our world. And it has a lot to do with what we do as Christians. But it has even more to do with what people from without say about those that are within the church. I've entitled our lesson, Regular Compassion. And I did so because I wanted to draw the contrast to the word compassion. There's not irregular compassion. There's not opposite compassion. There's simply one thing, and there's only one type of compassion that exists. It's a regular compassion. It's normal compassion. Now, we could spend the time just talking about compassion. And when we think about a basic feeling or basic definition of compassion, we think about a feeling in which we want to help someone in the distresses or problems in which they're in. And that could be a good form of compassion. But when we get into a deeper thought and we try to understand compassion in a deeper sense, in a more full sense, we think of this definition: a sympathetic consciousness of others' distresses with a great mental sense to alleviate problems. Compassion. As we look through Jesus' ministry upon the earth, what did we see? And what word did we even use this morning? Compassion. When we looked at our sermon this morning talking about heaven and talking about that centurion that had faith, what did we see Jesus responding with? Not only to the centurion, but also to all those that were still there. Compassion. Tonight I want us to look at 3 different areas, and go ahead and turn with me to Mark chapter 3. That's where we will begin this evening, Mark chapter 3, in our journey through this word compassion. And I want us to look in 3 different accounts of 3 different areas, all in which center around the word compassion. The first coming from Mark chapter 3, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 6. And this is described as a man who has a withered hand. And I want us to see that in these entanglements we can be compassionate. Let's just read Mark 3, 1 through 6, and then we'll discuss it. We find as we begin, and he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there which had a withered hand. And they watched him whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he said unto the man which had the withered hand, Stand forth. And he said unto them, It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath day, or to do evil, to save a life, or to kill. But they held their peace. And when he looked around about them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, Stretch forth thy hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as another. And the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. This is, to me, one of the most interesting accounts. It's going to be recorded in other places in Matthew chapter 12 and even in Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 6. But what we see about this event is sometimes compassion means you're the only one. Sometimes compassion means you're the only one. Now remember our first definition or our second definition of compassion, the full definition. A sympathetic consciousness of others' distresses together with a desire to alleviate them. Here was a man, as we begin our reading, and he entered in again the synagogue, and there was a man there which had the withered hand. There was only one person in the earth, one person that ever walked on the earth at the time in which we're reading, in which could walk into a synagogue, look over and see a man, and fulfill his need, whatever it may have been. Luke chapter 6, verse 6 says this took place on another Sabbath. It indicated that Matthew grouped some events together on the subject, but when we look here, this was on a particular Sabbath. It was what was happening at that time. Since the following episodes deal with the same subject, it amounts to the continuation of what's happening in the chapter and in the book. But what we find is the interesting reaction to the Lord. When we think about the key facts of this particular section, there's some things I want us to notice. Luke points out unto us exactly what's going on with this man. Matthew and Mark just say the man's hand was withered. Luke points out that the man's right hand was withered, but the others did not. I want you to know it doesn't really matter what hand it was, because we know, as the man with the withered hand knows, and those in which were there watching, didn't matter. His hand was malformed, and that's the beginning of our discussion. You know, we look at this particular section and we see all of the bad that could have happened in this particular scenario. When we start thinking about those that were watching him, and they begin to question him, is it help? We can just see them there. I don't know if you read through biblical accounts, and as you're going through them, you start to see the scene become painted. And you start to see these men in which were responding to Jesus, and you can almost see them. You can almost just see them watching so intently that if anything different would have happened, they would have fallen out of the chair. And they weren't going to take their eyes off of Jesus the whole time, and they just sat there intently watching. I want to ask a question when we're thinking about the key facts of this particular event. Where were these people that were watching this? They were in the synagogue too. Notice how it begins. And he entered again into the synagogue. These people who were in this room should have been the most religious people that existed. They were in the synagogue. They weren't people that just visited the synagogue to look at its beautiful architecture. These were people that upon this time of the day, and we don't know exactly what time of the day it was, they were there. But you know, they were angry. And for us, it would have been easy for us to say, you know, he could have just said, no, I'm not going to do anything. But you know, when we think about compassion and we think about our definition, a sympathetic consciousness to alleviate and have that desire to alleviate the other's problems, you know, compassion doesn't center around any other thing. It did not matter who was saying anything to him or what was going to be said to them or what he could have done or what he could have done differently in the particular section of this parable. But we see this depiction. Read with me verse 5 again. And when he had looked round about them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, Stretch forth thy hand. And he stretched it out with his hand, and his hand was restored, whole as the other. It's interesting about how he responded to them. notice it doesn't, as we looked at one account this morning, he looked at them with anger and drove them out of the synagogue. Or it doesn't say that he looked at them with anger and he told that man to leave. And it doesn't say that he looked on them with anger and he gave them the what for. As soon as Jesus entered into the synagogue, what did he notice? A man with a withered hand. And it was the biggest thing in the room that he noticed. What were the other people looking at? How many times did this man with a withered hand come inside of the synagogue and see these people, these Pharisees? And how many times did they see him come into that particular synagogue and they never once came to him and said, how can we help? See, when we're looking at this attitude of compassion, we're seeing there's two sides of the coin. There is compassion in which Jesus is showing, and then there is the other lifestyle. And we don't say it's a compassionate lifestyle. Some might say they were compassionate by not talking to them, and that might be today's standard of compassion. But here were these men who had always seen this man come into the synagogue, and seemingly, as far as we know, never said a word about them. You know, anger can be, and is in many cases, a tragedy for the Christian. Because many times when we get angry, what do? We sin. And we know Scripture tells us, be angry and sin not. So anger was not the problem here. The problem is depicted here in verse 5. He was grieved for the hardness of their hearts. Here were men in the synagogue, and they spent a lot of time there. And they never once mentioned to this man, what can we do? You know, they may have never been anything they could have done, but they did such. Jesus is going to give a response to this particular section. And I want us to go over to Mark chapter 12 to notice something before we think about this. Mark chapter 12. Because there's something that needs to be tied together with all of this in verses 11 and 12. Mark 12, 11 and 12. We find as we look at verse 11, this was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they sought to lay hold on him, but feared the people, for they knew that he had spoken the parable against them, and they left and went on their way. I want us to notice what's happening in Mark chapter 12 as we're considering Mark chapter 3. And it's the same scenario happening again and again and again with Jesus. He had compassion on someone, and there was one group of people that didn't like it. Now let's ask the question as we begin to think about the rest of our discussion that began with this man with the withered hand. Does it matter? Does it matter when talking about compassion what so-and-so is going to say about what we did? Does it matter what so-and-so is going to say because we did the right thing? And the answer is no. And the same thing in the case of what we're seeing in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. There was an occasion in which needed to be met. And we know before that occasion was met, Jesus knew these individuals' hearts. Now, we do not have the privilege, the honor, the ability to be able to know your heart. I do not know what your heart's thinking right now. And I don't know what it was thinking this morning. And I'm not going to know what it's thinking tomorrow. There's only one biblical heart I can control, and that's mine. And we're seeing a depiction of the biblical heart happening here, but the biblical heart of Jesus. It didn't matter what these other men thought. You know, they were appealing to the old law, and it would have been wrong for someone on the Sabbath day to go to work. But Jesus knew just as much compassion was something that was to be exemplified at all times in life. And that's the same thing the Old Testament would shed light upon. But they were trying to trick him. But he went about it anyways. The response that Jesus gave in Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, is the idea that man is worth helping. Man is simply worth helping. So that's what we see here. Turn with me and let's go to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18, and let's notice another account of something that's going to be interesting to us. Luke is the only writer to record this information for us in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. We're going to see this Pharisee and this tax collector. And we're going to see the two characters that are going to be present in this particular scenario. One in which was quiet. The other of which was very loud. If you're looking here in Luke chapter 18, just begin with me in verse 9. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. Did Jesus have to speak this to these individuals? Did he need to? Was it his responsibility? Or do we see something else that's taking place here? Here were a group of people, as we begin in verse 9, they trusted in themselves that they were righteous, which gives us the idea they thought they didn't need God to stand as a good man, to stand as a righteous person. And they despised others. In other words, everyone else was just not good enough to be with them. They couldn't stand them. They were the lowest of the low. Was it Jesus' responsibility to say to these people, here's what you're doing? Or could he have just passed by the way and never said anything? I want you to notice not only does compassion talk about helping others, but sometimes compassion is involved in what we say to others. Sometimes compassion is involved in what we say to others, and we'll see this as we go. Verse 10, 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and this one tops them all. And even as this publican, I fast twice in the week, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican standing afar off would not so much lift his eyes into heaven, but smote his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. There were two people in this account. Both of them were doing the exact same thing, or at least trying to. One was praying very loudly. And when he prayed, everyone in that area would have heard him. And he knew that. The other was very quiet. And he kept his head down. He wouldn't lift his eyes up to the heavens. The other calls him by who he is. The one who was praying never says anyone else's name. And we're seeing this contrast that's happening in this parable. Both men had access to the temple to pray. Both men had some type of relationship with the Lord. Both were evidently Jewish men. The Jews attended daily service in the temple. And these two individuals obviously had went up into the temple for that service. This was a regular time. Every other people would have been there. The Pharisee, being one of the two principal sects of the Jews, he would have been noted, and he was a man who would call himself a ritualistic obeyer of the law. If he saw the law, he was going to obey it. That would be what he would say. And here's what he does. He mocks those that are around him. Then we have this other individual, the publican. He was a man who would have collected revenue and taxes under the Roman government. And he would have been classed with the outcast and the sinners. He's as low as it gets. And we see this prayer that's being prayed. And we see it's very short in verse 13. There's more information depicting in verse 13 of the one who is praying and how he is praying than his prayer. And then the words that he's saying in the midst of his prayer. And it's a very easy prayer than which can be remembered. God be merciful to me, a sinner. The two people that are characterized in this parable are not really the depiction of the compassion in which we're seeing. We're seeing one who had no compassion, and that's evident, but the other not displaying either. But the point is being made of those in which Jesus was around. He saw these two individuals, or these other individuals, as he begins it in verse 9. And when we look at it, and he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves. And he depicts them as this Pharisee. And it's interesting for us to note that as they were thinking about what Jesus was saying, they would have been able to picture these men. It's very possible they were these men, or it's possible they were trying to become these men. You know what the response that Jesus gave in this particular section? It comes in verse 14. I tell you that this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. You may be wondering right now, what does this have to do with compassion? You know, the parable really has nothing to do with compassion. But we've said everything we've said in that response to get back to verse 9. And he spake this parable unto certain of them. Have you ever had anybody warn you in your life? Have you ever had anybody tell you, you probably shouldn't do that? Was that done out of anger? Was that done out of spite? Or was that done out of compassion because they know the reaction that's going to be? Or they know the road that you're getting ready to head down. You see, compassion, as we began, was about helping in that need which looked physical. But compassion can be on the same depiction. It can be helping those physical things in which we do. Here were two that they thought they were spiritual. They thought they were righteous. And they trusted in themselves, despising others. And that was the Pharisee in the parable. But here's the opposite side of it, the compassion side. It happens in verse 14. And it involves the word justification. If Jesus had never spoken these words unto these individuals, most likely they would have went on life like nothing ever had changed. But he used his compassion to depict unto them what they needed to do in life. So we've looked at two accounts. We're going to look at another one. If you'll just turn back just a little bit to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. And I want us to notice one final account that's going to give us a depiction of something that I believe is quite serious. Luke chapter 7, and go all the way down to verse 36. Now this is one of the longer particular sections of this. And it's going to be the longest thing in which we look at tonight. If you look at Luke chapter 7 and you begin with verse 36, notice who we see. And one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him. And he went down into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. Jesus would dine with anyone in which was there. And Matthew chapter 9 verse 10 gives us the idea whether it was a Pharisee or it was a publican or it was just a regular everyday person. He was going to be around them and he was going to immerse himself into their lives and he was going to show them what life really was. But this Pharisee asked him to come sit down and meat. We look at verse 37, and behold, a woman in the city which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus was sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed her feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now notice verse 39 carefully. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. There's going to be a contrast that's made here in this particular section of the one in which judges others without compassion. It's evident unto us, and sometimes we are the epitome of verse 39. Because we know whether we've done this or not. We don't like to think about that very often, do we? Because it means that we were the Pharisee here. But sometimes don't we do this? Don't we see a group of people and we expect only certain results from them? Or we see a certain classification of people that exists in the midst of our society and we just know why they are in that position? And we just know what type of people they are and what type of people they're always going to be. That's the attitude here of verse 39. He could not believe that Jesus let this woman wash his feet and anoint them with oil that came from that alabaster box here in the chapter. Let's continue on reading just to get some more context of what's happening. Notice verse 40. And Jesus answered. Hit the pause button real quick. What is he answering? Go back up to verse 39. He spake within himself. Go back to verse 40. And Jesus answering, saying, I want us to notice something, and this is really just by way of passing. We're not going to get anything by the Lord. If we can sit here and we imagine things and we say them within ourselves, the Lord knows. We're not going to get it by the Lord, and neither did this other man. He said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he saith, Master, say on. Pretty sure he was confident. I'm not going to get caught, or he doesn't know what I'm thinking. Verse 41, there was a certain creditor which had two debtors. One owed 500 pounds and the other 50. He frankly gave them both. Tell me therefore which of them will love him most. Simon answered and said, I suppose he to whom he forgave most. And said unto him, Thou hast rightly judged. And he turned unto the woman and said unto Simon, Seest this woman? I entered into thine house, and thou gavest me no water for my feet. But she has washed my feet with tears, and wiped them off with hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou did not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he saith unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, Who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said unto the woman, Thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace. Now, we're not trying to get into the ins and outs of what Jesus did and why that is important to us in our reality of life and why that's a depiction of what individuals can be looking at. We're not getting into the tactics of what he did for this woman or what she did for him. We're not trying to get involved in everything that was happening inside that house. But this particular parable brought forth a thoughtful answer. Here was a man who despised the one who was a sinner. But yet to himself, he presented no blame. We can almost paint that picture again in our minds as she's down there wiping his feet as mentioned with her tears. She knew what manner of life she lived. It's obvious this man who had invited Jesus to come eat with him, he knew who this woman was. And he knew what kind of life she lived. Jesus, he knew who this woman was, and he knew what type of life she lived. You see, on this particular scenario, the compassion comes not from Jesus, but from the woman in which is meeting with him. She never seemingly, except at the end, met with him face to face. But in the midst of the conversation that was happening, there she was at his feet, doing what needed to be done. She saw a need. And she did such. You know, the response to this parable, the point was given, there was an attitude between the two debtors. One in which was forgiven little. The other was forgiven a great deal. There was compassion shown on the one in which was going to exact those debts, but he forgave them with compassion. But there's also compassion being shown from those in which have debt. And I want to tell you as we're ending our discussion tonight, we are the ones that have the debt. Some of us have little, but some of us have much. And the indication is not specifically given on the much or the little, but the reaction from both. Both should have been repentive in what they were doing. This Pharisee in which had Jesus over, he was not guilty. He was not free from sin, but he acted that way. So the compassion that's being shown was this depiction of this man's lifestyle. Don't continue living like you're sinless when your life is just as bad as hers. Even though you've been forgiven little, you've been forgiven so much. You know, compassion forgives. Compassion forgives with repentance. This woman, whatever she had done, it was obvious that she knew what she had done. And she wanted to make it right down to washing a man's feet with her tears. But the other man, he knew what he had done, yet it's never verbally mentioned from him. He never shows any sign of sorrows, but he really enjoyed having Jesus in his home. And sometimes I may believe that's how our world feels. We really enjoy having Jesus in our home, and we love to wear him as a badge upon our chest. But we forget we're the one that should be at the table, washing the feet, because that's what we deserve. The compassion showed her that day that that's not what she deserved. Compassion. It's a sympathetic consciousness of others' distresses, together with a desire to alleviate it. You know, we could take a discussion of compassion into all sorts of different areas. And we could talk about how we need to be compassionate for our community, and our community needs some great help. We could talk about how we need to be compassionate about those in which are lost, and those in which are lost have a great need. But I want to center our minds upon one thing that involves compassion. We need to be compassionate to ourselves. And here's what I mean. If you are a child of God tonight, and there's sin in your life, and you need to make it right, show yourself the compassion that you deserve and make it right. You can take compassion away from yourself. And you can go home tonight and never make anything right with the Lord, and you can take that away from yourself. But you and I both know that if you do that, it will haunt you. And you will worry about it all night long, won't you? It may be that case. Starting with compassion begins with ourselves. It may be the case tonight that you're not a child of God at all. Now, I want to encourage you, there is no better time than right now to become a child of God. There are many things in which we could do tonight. Becoming a child of God would be the most important. It would become the memory of a lifetime at this very moment, because you realized you needed compassion too. And you understood the only place you're going to get it is with the Lord and not with mankind. So compassion. What are we going to do with it? Hopefully from the future we'll realize we need to serve with compassion as Jesus had. We'll need to help instruct with the compassion that Jesus had. And we'll need to sometimes, as it is, wash the feet with compassion as Jesus was washed, so that we can show the proper compassion in our world, and so that we can be with heaven with our Lord one day. If you have a need tonight, whether it's becoming a child of God or whether it's making your life right, why don't you do so as together we stand and sing.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed